The case you're about to see is a fictional one, but the procedure is legally accurate. The characters are played by actors, but the jury is selected from members of the general public.
Tessa Joan Alexander Blackley, you stand charged on indictment with arson contrary to Section 1(3) of the Criminal Damage Act 1971. The particulars of this offence being that you, on the 23rd day of April 1978, without lawful excuse, damaged by fire a house belonging to Richard Hansen and Lynn Hansen, intending to damage property or being reckless as to whether property would be damaged, and intending by the said damage to endanger the life of Lynn Hansen or being reckless as to whether the life of Lynn Hansen would be thereby endangered. Do you plead guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Mr. George Ford.
Brought the brochure for us to look at. I thought the Greek trip sounded nicest. Oh, there's the Paris excursion. You enjoyed that last time. Oh, do you want to go or don't you?
Whatever you like.
I tell you what I'd like. I'd just like to go away and forget about all this. When it's over, I don't just want to go home and have it all start up again.
It isn't likely to start up again, is it? She'll be in prison.
Now, Mr. Ford, would you describe to the court the damage done to Mr. Hansen's property, Mill House?
The fire started in the kitchen. The extension on the south side of the main building was pretty well gutted, and so was the adjoining garage. The studio above was also destroyed. Fortunately, the fire was brought under control before it reached the main building. The fire burnt itself out just before it reached the front door, which links the two wings.
Yes. Now, Mr. Ford, as a result of your investigations, were you able to conclude how the fire started?
Yes, someone had done it deliberately.
Now, how could you establish that?
Some piles of old newspapers and magazines. They'd been piled against the wall under one of the windows. They hadn't all been destroyed because the wind had carried the fire away from there. There were some odds and ends left, and they were found to have paraffin on them.
Did you find evidence that paraffin had been used elsewhere?
Yes, sir, on the floor and walls of the covered way. Quite a lot of it. The place reeked of it, in fact.
My lord, we will be bringing evidence later to show that a paraffin can was found in Miss Blackley's possession after the fire.
Thank you.
Now, were you able to establish, Mr. Ford, how entry had been effected?
A narrow window in the garage wall. It appeared to have been broken before the fire started.
How could you tell that?
Well, sir, when glass is subjected to intense heat, it scorches before it breaks. We found some broken glass outside this garage window which hadn't any scorch marks. That's how.
I see. And as we know, Mr. Ford, after the fire, Miss Blackley was found to have badly cut hands, which would have been consistent with someone breaking a window whilst forcing an entry.
Yes, sir.
Yes. How long would it take for someone to get in and start a fire like that?
Probably only a few minutes.
Yes. Now, would a person of Miss Blackley's build be able to make the entry that you've just described?
Oh, yes, no trouble. With respect to Mr. and Mrs. Hansen, they had made it very easy for someone to get in. A lovely big rain barrel outside the window, and on the inside, a trestle table for a comfortable landing.
Mr. Ford, thank you very much.
Mr. Ford, can you say for certain that this fire was the work of one person and one person only?
No, only that one person could have done it.
Nonetheless, more than one person could have been involved?
Yes.
A group of children, for example?
Possibly.
Isn't it a fact that your branch of the fire brigade was called out to deal with a fire started by a bunch of local children only 3 weeks before the fire of Mr. Hansen's property?
Yes, an old broken-down hut at the bottom of some allotments. The kids used it as a sort of meeting place. Somebody got a bit too clever with the matches. Nothing more than a kids' game that got out of hand.
A kids' game, Mr. Ford? Which occurred significantly, it would seem to me, only a very short time before a similar act of vandalism at Mr. Hansen's property.
All I can say is, madam, is that the incident with the hut was investigated quite thoroughly at the time, and that it was thought unnecessary to take things any further.
Thank you, Mr. Ford.
Mrs. Hansen, what time did you go out in the afternoon of April 23rd this year?
About 2:30, I went to the shops.
And what time did you return?
5:45.
And at either of those times, did you notice any packs of children hanging about suspiciously?
No, I saw no one at all.
Was your house still burning when you returned?
Oh, yes, I could see thick smoke as I drove into our lane. I just thought, oh, God, got there as fast as I could, but there wasn't much point. I mean, I couldn't have put it out.
At what stage was the fire at by then?
I don't think it could have been burning for long because there weren't any flames in the studio when I got there. The studio went up when I was running back to my car.
Yes, so the fire hadn't been burning for long. There was definitely no children in the area. Perhaps we might infer from that whoever started the fire made a quick getaway in a car.
Oh, no, really. My lord.
Yes, Mrs. Vincent?
The only inference that can be drawn is that the fire couldn't possibly have been started before 4:30, by which time Miss Blackley was well away from the area. The culprits could possibly have run away across the surrounding fields without Mrs. Hansen seeing them, as her attention would have been, of course, on the burning house.
Yes. Mr. Parsons, I really don't think you can infer that the person responsible had a car solely from what Mrs. Hansen's told us.
Very well, my lord. Mrs. Hansen, what did you do after you saw the fire?
I drove to Mrs. Willoughby's. She's our nearest neighbour, and I phoned the fire brigade from there and the police.
Had something happened prior to the fire which caused you to call the police?
Yes. Threats had been made.
Threats? Who by?
Tessa, Miss Blackley.
The accused had threatened you?
Yes.
Yes. Of course, Miss Blackley is no stranger to you, is she?
Well, you could put it that way. She's my his girlfriend.
What sort of threats had Miss Blackley made to you?
She talked about burning down the house. She was also violent with me a couple of times.
Yes. Can you remember the first time she was violent to you? Can you remember the date?
It was in March last year, the 14th, I think. Well, it was after I found a letter from her to Richard. And I opened it by accident. I wasn't going through his things or anything. Anyway, it all came out. The usual story. He'd been seeing this girl for about 6 months, and she was on at him to move in with her and, ditch me. I was pregnant at the time, about 3 months pregnant, but I hadn't told him up till then. I suppose that made this affair different.
Different?
Oh, she wasn't the first. Richard's had his flings before. I mean, he always comes back to me. Anyway, I got her address from her letter, and I went round to see her. It was just to talk to her. Our marriage was not unhappy. I didn't want it to break up just because of some other girl. I loved him, and I was going to have a baby.
Yes, so, Mrs. Hansen, what happened when you went to Miss Blackley's flat?
When she opened the door, I said who I was and asked if I could come in and talk it over. She just said, no, go away, or something like that, and she tried to push the door closed in my face. Well, that made me a bit angry, so I pushed back at her. Then she grabbed hold of me instead and started kicking and punching. It was as if she really hated me. I really thought she wanted to kill me. Then I saw that Richard had come to the door. He'd been there with her. He dragged her away from me. Then I asked him to come home with me. Tessa started crying and begging him not to go.
Yes, please, go on, Mrs. Hansen.
Well, when we got to her gate, she shouted at me. She said, if you ever come back here again, I promise I will kill you.
So, did you receive any injuries at the hands of Miss Blackley?
Oh, a few bruises, nothing much, but a few weeks later, my pregnancy ended in a miscarriage. The doctor said the incident with Tessa might have caused it. I mean, please don't think I've got a history of miscarriages, you see. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't have mattered, the fight.
Yes, but as a result of your miscarriage, did your husband come to some decision about his relationship with Miss Blackley?
He said he was going to end his relationship with her.
Yes, and did he?
No. I mean, he tried, but I suppose that made her hate me even more. I mean, she probably thought I had the miscarriage on purpose.
Mrs. Hansen, when was your next encounter with Miss Blackley?
It was about 3 months after my miscarriage at the end of June last year.
The end of June 1977. What happened then?
She came round to our house during the afternoon.
Yes. Did she give any reason for her visit?
She was crying and upset. It seems that she just found out she was pregnant. I don't think she'd come to triumph about it over me or anything like that. It was just... Oh, I don't know what nonsense Richard had been telling her, but she said she wanted to see the house.
The house? Why was that? Did she say?
She said she wanted to see why I'd had such a strong hold over Richard that he was prepared to stay with me when he much preferred her. I mean, she was absolutely convinced nothing I said to her had any effect. She was going to have an abortion, and it was all my fault and the fault of the house.
She said that the house had a strong hold on Richard. How could the house have a hold on him?
Well, it's true in a way. The house really does mean an awful lot to him. He's an architect, you see, a very good one. He bought this house 7 years ago when we got married. It was just a broken-down old barn thing then. He's put all his money and everything into it.
Did Miss Blackley say what she meant about the house?
That if it were not for the existence of this house and the fact that I'd be in it as the marital home in the event of a divorce, Richard would give me up. But she wouldn't see that it wasn't completely the house. I mean, it was me as well. I mean, Richard's feelings, they were for me too. He hadn't just stopped loving me or anything like that.
Yes, did Miss Blackley make any threats to you when she came that afternoon last year?
Well, it was a bit strange, actually. I mean, I thought she was joking at first, but... Well, you know she's a journalist.
Yes.
Well, apparently she'd been writing this story about an IRA bomb factory. She kept going on about firebombs. She suddenly said, you know, I've done this story. Well, they told me how you make them. Firebombs. She said I wasn't to be surprised. Nothing happened to the house.
Words. You weren't to be surprised if something happened to the house.
Yes. And I thought she was joking, but she said, one day that's what I'll do.
And when was the next time you came into contact with Miss Blackley?
It was on March the 29th this year at a party. Well, I was talking to a group of friends when she came up to me. She was obviously drunk because she was swaying and her speech was slurred. Anyway, she started, well, calling me a silly bitch and things. And eventually I reacted and I told her to go away. And she slapped my face and pushed me against the wall and started going on about her and Richard in the house again, how it was the only reason Richard didn't leave me.
Can you remember her exact words?
She said, you don't think he stays because of you, do you? He only stays because of that bloody house of his. He doesn't give a damn about you, it's the house. Tell you what, I think I'll burn the house down, then you'll have nothing.
Tell you what, I think I burn the house down.
Excuse me, Mr. Parsons. Mrs. Hansen, what effect did Miss Blackley's intervention in your marriage have on you?
Well, I was depressed, really. I mean, not just because of Tessa, not just because Richard was still seeing her. I mean, part of it was that I wanted to have a baby. Well, I didn't seem to be able to, and she did, Tessa. She'd got herself pregnant again, and there was I not even able to. So I was depressed, and I was being treated by my doctor with tranquilizers.
Did your husband know about this?
Yes. Well, I wasn't going to tell him, but 2 days after the party, I tried to take an overdose. I mean, it was a stupid thing to do, I know that. It wasn't even as if I took enough to, you know, kill me. But Richard was terribly upset, and he said he was going to see Tessa and break things off once and for all. That if she wanted to go ahead with her pregnancy, he would support the child, but that would be it.
And did he break things off?
He tried the night before the fire. I mean, I don't even know whether he has. Left her, I mean. He says he has, but then he said that before.
Yes. Now, Mrs. Hansen, can we go back to the night before the fire? What did your husband say then?
He said he was going to see Tessa and tell her that that was it. He was away for ages. I got worried. I sat by the window waiting for him to come back. I mean, I thought maybe he isn't going to come back. Anyway, around 2 in the morning, I heard a car come down our lane. I saw the headlights go past, and it was raining, so you could hear the tires. She often used to run him home. They'd park in a track beyond our house and whatever.
Could you see them?
No. There's lots of trees and undergrowth and things. Anyway, about another half hour went by, and then Richard came in. He was very upset. He was crying.
And after that, did Miss Blackley's car leave?
Yes, after Richard came in, I heard it start up and drive back down the lane.
Yes. So Miss Blackley definitely left with her car that evening?
Oh, yes.
Yes. Now, I want us to raise one other matter, Mrs. Hansen. After the fire brigade had put the fire out on April the 23rd, you went back into the house?
Yes.
Did you notice anything?
Yes, when I'd gone out earlier, I'd left the radio on.
Yes, so someone calling at the house might have gained the impression you were listening to the radio when in fact you weren't there at all.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Hansen.
Mrs. Hansen, let's go back to the night before the fire. You told us that Miss Blackley drove off after your running your husband home, didn't you?
Yes.
Mrs. Fenton, I don't know why you attach importance to the question of why she was there with the car that night. Surely the question is, was she there with the car the next afternoon? And if so, what time?
My lord, Miss Blackley does not deny being in the lane at some stage in the following afternoon, but it's an important part of her case that her car suffered a breakdown the night before. She wasn't able to drive it away. In consequence of that, she went back the next day to repair it and collect it.
Oh, yes, I see, yes, of course. Thank you.
Mrs. Hansen, how do you know it was Miss Blackley's car?
I heard Richard's key in the door, then a car started up and drove back down the lane.
When it started, were you watching it?
I looked out of the window when I heard it and saw it go past.
Your house is situated in a country lane. You've told us you couldn't see the car when it was parked because of the surrounding trees and the undergrowth. It was the middle of the night. It was extremely dark. How do you know it was Miss Blackley's car?
Well, because it couldn't have been anyone else's starting up and then going off.
On the contrary, there's absolutely no reason why the motorist shouldn't have been using your lane.
It was her.
But from your house at that time of night, you couldn't possibly distinguish one car from another. Mrs. Hansen, you're under oath. Can you truthfully say that the car which drove down that lane was beyond doubt Miss Blackley's?
Well, all right, now I can't, not completely beyond doubt.
Thank you. Now, you told us that on March the 14th last year, you went round to Miss Blackley's flat. Why was that?
Well, I was pregnant and I was jolly well going to tell her I was. I thought maybe she'd think twice about poaching my husband.
So what sort of mood were you in?
A bit desperate and pretty angry.
Yes, so angry, in fact, that you were prepared to use violence to force your way into the flat, weren't you?
It wasn't me who was violent.
But you told us yourself that when Miss Blackley quite understandably refused to let you in, you forced the door open. Would you not call that violent behaviour on your part?
Well, she started the kicking and punching.
But that was in self-defence, surely, as a last resort, when you violently, hysterically forced your way into the flat.
Well, I only wanted to talk to her.
But your husband was there. Can Miss Blackley really be blamed for doing everything in her power to prevent you going through an extremely embarrassing and painful encounter?
Well, she can certainly be blamed for threatening to kill me.
But you tried to force your way into the flat you were leaving with a man she loved. At the time, you recognised, did you not, that her threat to kill you was nothing more than a rather melodramatic parting shot?
No, I didn't. She meant it.
But you didn't go to the police then, did you?
No.
Well, really, Mrs. Hansen. Now, Miss Blackley's visit to your house in June last year, or your version of it, rather, has a highly melodramatic flavour, doesn't it?
I don't know what you're getting at, sorry.
In June of last year, Miss Blackley came to see you, in your own words, crying and upset because she was pregnant and about to face the trauma of an abortion. She made a request to you, didn't she?
I don't think so.
Don't you recall Miss Blackley asking you to let your husband support the child so that she wouldn't have to have her pregnancy terminated?
Well, that certainly wasn't the impression I got.
What was the impression you got?
That she'd already decided to have the abortion.
Was that the impression you had then, or the impression you convinced yourself afterwards that you
I
had?
haven't convinced myself of anything.
No. Then will you admit this, that Miss Blackley was in an extremely unhappy state?
Yes, of course, I've said she was upset, crying, that kind of thing. I'm a bit confused.
And are you asking the court to believe that Miss Blackley underwent a sudden, most eccentric reversal of mood and proceeded coolly, calculatingly, quite unemotionally to threaten to, what was it, throw a firebomb at the house?
Yes.
She said I wasn't to be surprised if something happened to the house. Mrs. Hansen, can you be telling the court that an intelligent and articulate person like Miss Blackley suddenly started talking like a villainess in a third-rate gangster film?
Well, look, she did say those things.
I suggest to you that your imagination, your natural prejudice against Miss Blackley have pieced together a quite fantastic slice of melodrama.
Look, I tell you, she did say all that. You may think it sounds melodramatic, but that is what she did say.
As you wish. Now, you told us, did you not, that your next encounter with Miss Blackley was at a party on March the 29th this year?
That's right, yes.
Your version of the events was incomplete, though, wasn't it?
I don't think so.
I was talking to a group of friends when she came up to me. That wasn't the first time you'd spoken to Miss Blackley that evening, was it?
Well, no, but...
But what?
Well, we'd said one or two things to each other before. I mean, we had to, talking in groups, that sort of thing. Social chat.
Oh, really, Mrs. Hansen, do you define, there's that little tart of my husband's, as social chat?
I didn't say that to her.
Oh, you may not have said it to her, but you said it knowing that she could hear it, didn't you?
I may have said it, though, frankly, I don't remember. I certainly wouldn't have meant her to hear.
Ah, you don't remember saying it, but your memory of Miss Blackley's actions is so clear.
Look, I remember what Miss Blackley said. I don't remember what I said, that's all.
Well, may I suggest to you, then, that your recollections appear to have been a little bit selective?
Listen, it was a party. There was lots of noise, people drinking, that sort of thing. I mean, I can't remember everything, can I?
Well... How much did you have to drink, Mrs. Hansen?
Not much.
There are two people who were at that party, your husband and Miss Blackley, who can testify under oath that you'd been drinking pretty heavily.
Well, I'm sorry, but I was not drunk.
Well, as you have no recollection of what you said, I can only suggest that by the time your exchanges with Miss Blackley occurred, you had actually been drinking pretty heavily. You had only the haziest and most unreliable recollections of what was said.
I can remember very well what happened.
You behave violently when you're angry, don't you?
What? No.
No? Didn't you cut your husband's face by throwing a glass at him once during one of your quarrels about Miss Blackley?
All right, look, that was one domestic quarrel. You're trying to make it seem as though I'm...
As though what?
Well, as though I make a habit of that sort of thing.
Isn't that the impression you've been trying very hard to create about Miss Blackley?
Look, it's not an impression.
You've told us that you were so distressed by your husband's relationship with Miss Blackley that you took an overdose of tranquilizers. Now, would you agree that when you took this action, you were a very disturbed person?
No, it was just stupid and silly. I didn't mean to kill myself.
Oh, now, come on. You'd heard that Miss Blackley was pregnant for the second time. She intended to keep her child. You'd not be human, would you, if with your most unfortunate history of miscarriages, you weren't disturbed, upset? Do you not agree that you were disturbed by it?
All right, I was unhappy, but I certainly was not going round the twist about it. I was just being silly and dramatic.
So you admit, do you, that you have a tendency to dramatize things?
No, I don't admit that at all.
No? Well, then how could you describe your action when, during another quarrel with your husband, you actually shattered a window in your house?
Look, I don't know what you're getting at, sorry.
Your reactions and your feelings during a very disturbing situation were no different from those you want to convince us that Miss Blackley had. Are we not to infer from that that you are just as likely as she was to set fire to your house?
No, because I'm not that kind of person.
Miss Blackley is?
Yes.
The case of the Queen against Blackley will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court.
Richard Hansen, please.
Today's case in the Crown Court concerns a fire at the home of Richard and Lynn Hansen. As a result of police inquiries, Tessa Blackley, Richard's girlfriend, has been charged with damaging property with intent. Yesterday, evidence was given that paraffin had been used deliberately to start the fire, and that Tessa had previously made threats to Lynn, Richard's wife.
Now, Mr. Hansen, on the night before the fire, April the 22nd this year, did you see Miss Blackley?
Yes, I told her that we had to end our relationship.
Yes, and what was her reaction?
Well, she was distraught.
Well, what did she say in her distraught state?
Well, in the heat of the moment, a lot of things got said.
What sort of things? I mean, what exactly did Miss Blackley say, Mr. Hansen?
Well, she said she'd like to get hold of a gun and shoot the three of us. And that Lynn and I better watch out because she was going to throw bricks through our bedroom window. I mean, it was emotional nonsense.
Yes, was that how you regarded it at the time?
I don't know. Well, yes, I suppose I did take it seriously, all of it. I mean, it was a very highly charged atmosphere.
Yes, the sort of highly charged atmosphere, in fact, in which Miss Blackley might have carried out her threats.
I don't know. Maybe, yes.
Does Miss Blackley have a violent temper?
Well, she's very easygoing on the surface, but she's the kind of person who bottles things up, and then something triggers her off, and suddenly she overreacts completely.
Does she overreact in a violent way?
Well, yes, like when my wife went to visit her and tried to get into her flat, suddenly she went completely wild and started hitting out. I mean, she's like that. But that doesn't mean that she'd do something like set fire to the house.
Mr. Hansen, can you remember what your first words were to her after you had seen the damage to your house?
I think I said something like, oh, Christ, what have you gone and done now? I mean, well, it just seemed obvious at the time that Tessa had done it, but now... Look, I'm sorry. She says she hasn't done it, and I really...
What did she say at that time when you said, my God, what have you done now?
Well, nothing. Well, she wasn't saying very much anyway. It was when I went to visit her in the police station.
Yes, but never mind the circumstances. At the time, before you had a chance, shall we say, to rationalize events, you made it clear to Miss Blackley that you thought she had carried out her threats, and she didn't deny it.
Well, I don't know. No, it just seemed obvious at the time, that's all.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Hansen.
Mr. Hansen, during your relationship with Miss Blackley, what reasons did you give for remaining with your wife?
Well, I told her that I still loved my wife. Well, as well as her. I loved both of them. I couldn't choose. I didn't want to be made to choose.
Indeed. And you discussed your dilemma frequently with Miss Blackley?
Yes.
So far from believing that it was your house that kept the two of you apart, Miss Blackley was well aware of the real reason.
I don't know. I told her. I don't know whether she believed me.
Why should she not believe you?
Well, it wasn't what she wanted to hear. I mean, it wouldn't be, would it? Well, the person you love is involved with someone else. I mean, if you love someone, the thought of them being with someone else is awful. I mean, the thought of them loving someone else. I mean, it's so unbearable that if you admitted the truth to yourself, you'd go round the bend. So you tell yourself something else, like Tessa told herself that the reason that I wouldn't move in with her was because of the house.
Mr. Hansen, are we to infer from this very ingenious piece of psychoanalysis that Miss Blackley told you that herself?
No, but it was
then,
obvious.
in that case, would you confine yourself to the facts, which are that Miss Blackley knew full well, because you told her, that your decision to maintain the status quo had nothing to do with the house.
And look, please believe me, Tessa did have a thing about the house. Whenever we argued about it, about me staying with Lynn, it would always end up with her saying the reason that I wouldn't move in with her was because of, well, I wouldn't swap my beautiful, wonderful brainchild of a house for her shabby little flat.
Yes, but Mr. Hansen, what I really
Look,
want...
I'm sorry. My wife is right. She did have a thing about the house. I think my wife has already told you that, and if she has, it's the truth.
I presume you and your wife are now reconciled.
Yes, we are.
So naturally you wouldn't want to say anything that would prejudice that reconciliation.
I just don't want the court to be told that my wife is a liar.
Nobody has said your wife is a liar. From what you've told us, you've come to realize, after some calm reflection, that Miss Blackley is unlikely to be guilty. That's correct, is it not?
I don't know. I've thought about it so much I can't think clearly anymore. Well, one minute I think she must have done it, the next I think... I wish this bloody thing hadn't come to court in the first place.
When was the last time before the fire occurred that you had any contact with Miss Blackley?
Well, the evening before, when we said we had to finish.
No, I don't mean when did you last see Miss Blackley. I mean, when was the last time before the fire that you actually spoke to her?
Well, we had a bit of a phone conversation in the morning.
You telephoned her, in fact, didn't you?
Yes. Well, she'd been in such a state the night before, I thought I had to make sure she was okay.
And you told her then? She told you, did she, that she'd had a car breakdown?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, come on, surely you remember her saying that she'd had trouble with the car?
Well, she may have done. I just don't remember. I mean, she was always having trouble with that car of hers. She may have told me. It just went over my head. I mean, I was upset and worked up myself, and I was phoning from home and everything.
And your wife was around?
Yes.
But you did have time to make an arrangement to see each other again, didn't you?
Sort of, yes.
Sort of? You arranged to meet Miss Blackley for lunch the next day, didn't you?
Yes.
So that must have signified to Miss Blackley that far from ending your relationship, as you tried to on the previous night, you intended to continue it.
That we were just going to have lunch together and talk things over when we were a bit calmer.
You'd done that before, hadn't you?
Well, how do you mean?
Well, on several previous occasions, you'd attempted to end your relationship with Miss Blackley and then telephoned her the next day, unable to keep to your decision, and continued to see her. That's true, isn't it?
I suppose so, yes.
Well, what was there about this occasion that would signify to Miss Blackley that it was different?
I don't know. Nothing.
You'd agree, then, that she'd been in a fairly hopeful mood?
Possibly.
Yes, so if the prosecution are right, Miss Blackley, with the prospect of seeing you the next day, optimistic about the continuation of your relationship, decides to alienate you completely by attempting to destroy your house.
Look, I'm sorry. I honestly can't say. As far as I was concerned on the phone, the relationship was over.
As far as you were concerned, perhaps. 2 weeks before the fire, when Miss Blackley dropped you off outside your home, you had some trouble with a group of local children, didn't you?
Well, if you mean I had to tick a couple of them off, yes, I did.
About what?
Well, there were a couple of older kids. They were 13 or 14, and they were swinging on a gate that I'd just painted, so I told them to clear off, that's all.
They threatened you, didn't they?
Well, hardly. One of them said he was going to throw a brick through the window, I think.
Isn't that what you call a threat?
Well, not really. I mean, it isn't the sort of thing I can take seriously.
Did you mention the incident to the police after the fire?
No, I didn't.
Because you didn't take it seriously?
Yes, that's right.
Here were two youngsters vandalising your property, though perhaps in a very minor way, threatening to do greater damage. Don't you think your failure to tell the police was rather a serious omission?
Well, I hardly think that had anything to do with the fire, if that's what you mean.
Well, we don't know what they did or didn't do. Do we, Mr. Hansen? Because you were so preoccupied with the upheavals in your emotional life, you blindly disregarded this quite important incident. Occurred so shortly before the fire at your own house. You failed to report it to the police, and it's never been investigated.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Detective Constable Noreen Banks, Fulchester CID, Central Division.
Now, Detective Constable Banks, on April the 23rd this year, were you called to the scene of a fire at a house at Hexham, Fulchester?
Yes.
And as a result of your inquiries, did you visit Miss Blackley's flat later that same evening?
May I?
Yes?
Yes, I was accompanied by my colleague, Detective Constable Brian Wilkes. Miss Blackley answered the door, and I told her that we were making routine inquiries following an incident in the Hexham area and would like to ask her a few questions.
What did Miss Blackley say?
Miss Blackley replied, "It can't be anything to do with me. I don't know anything about Hexham."
Yes, did you notice anything particular about Miss Blackley's behaviour?
Well, straight away I could tell that she was drunk because she kept slurring her words, and you could smell alcohol very strongly on her breath.
Yes, did you notice anything in particular about her appearance?
One of her hands was quite heavily bandaged, and the other had some strips of plaster on it and some cuts that she hadn't covered up.
And as we've heard, whoever started this fire broke a window to gain entry into the house. Did you ask Miss Blackley how she had come to cut her hands?
Well, I said, did she mind telling me how she'd cut them? And she replied, "Yes, I bloody well would mind. It's none of your business." So then I told her she wasn't doing anyone any good by being so rude. And she replied, "You're not doing yourself much good either by being such a self-important little cow."
Were you able to get from her an account of her movements earlier that day?
Well, I asked if she'd mind telling me where she'd been all day, and she said she'd been at work. I asked where that was, and she said in the centre of town. I then asked her if she'd been in the Hexham area at any point, and she denied this very strongly. I told her that her car had been seen parked in the area by Mrs. Eileen Willoughby, a neighbour of Mr. and Mrs. Hansen's, that is, and I asked her if I could search it. It was parked outside her house.
And what did Miss Blackley say?
She said I could help myself, but that if I used any petrol, to be sure and replace it.
Yes, and did you search Miss Blackley's car?
Yes.
And what did you find?
A large oil can, a 4.5-litre can.
Yes, may the witness be shown Exhibit 2, please. Is this the can you found, Detective Constable Banks?
That was the one we found in her car, yes.
Can you say what it contained?
Yes, there was a small quantity of paraffin left at the bottom of the can. I then cautioned and arrested Miss Blackley and brought her down to the station for further questioning.
Yes, was Miss Blackley inclined to be more helpful by this time?
No. She refused for some time to give an account of her movements that day, and when we tried to take a statement, she insisted that she didn't know where Hexham was and couldn't have been anywhere near it. She was still very drunk, so we had to leave her for an hour or so to sober up.
Yes, and after Miss Blackley's enforced rest, was she more forthcoming?
Not much, no. I told her that her car had been seen by Mrs. Willoughby, and then Miss Blackley said that perhaps she'd been driving through the area and not known what it was called. I told her that I was aware that she was accustomed to driving her boyfriend, Mr. Hansen, home to Hexham several times a week, and eventually she admitted that her car had been parked that afternoon in the lane where Mr. and Mrs. Hansen's house is situated, as Mrs. Willoughby had said. She said that it had been there all night because it had suffered a breakdown and that she'd returned to repair and move it.
So eventually Miss Blackley did agree she had been near the Hansens' house on the afternoon of the fire. Her car had been parked in a lane nearby.
Yes.
Did you ask her, Miss Blackley, then why she lied about this to the police earlier?
Yes. She said she'd panicked because she was having an affair with Mr. Hansen and didn't want his wife to know that she'd been there.
Oh, how very considerate of Miss Blackley. Suddenly. Did she say what time she arrived in the lane and what time she left it?
Yes, according to her, she got there at around 2:30 and had gone by 3:30.
Yes, and did you check Mr. and Mrs. Hansen's home for fingerprints?
Oh, yes. We found fingerprints on the side door of the house, round the doorbell and letterbox mostly, as if someone had looked through to try and see if anybody was at home, that kind of thing. On the 24th of April, I asked Miss Blackley if she'd been to the house, and she said she hadn't. We then took her fingerprints, which matched the ones found on the side door. I then put this to her on the 31st of April when we had the results of the tests.
Yes, so what did Miss Blackley say?
She said she now remembered that she had been to the house. She told us that once she'd got her car going, she'd decided on the spur of the moment to see if Mrs. Hansen was in.
So she admitted she went to Mrs. Hansen's house to see if she was in. Did she say whether she thought, in fact, that she was in?
No, she said Mrs. Hansen wasn't in. There was no answer.
Yes. Did you ask her if she heard a radio playing?
Yes, she said she hadn't.
Did she say what happened after that?
She told us she returned to her car and drove back to work, arriving at around 10 to 4.
Yes. Did you ask Miss Blackley to furnish you with the names of some members of staff who might have seen her arrival?
Yes, she said that when she got back there was no one around.
But at 10 to 4 on a busy afternoon in the Fulchester Chronicle?
According to her, all her colleagues were at their local club.
10 to 4? One wonders whether the Fulchester Chronicle prints itself. And did she give an explanation as to how her hands came to be cut?
Yes. She said she'd knocked over a row of milk bottles and some of them had broken. She said she'd cut her hands while clearing them up.
Indeed. And did Miss Blackley say what she did with the remains of these depredations?
Well, first of all, she said she'd put them in her dustbin.
And had she?
Well, we accompanied her to the back of her house to check, but we couldn't find any broken glass in her dustbin.
Ah, and did Miss Blackley explain this mysterious piece of refuse disposal?
She said she'd made a mistake. She'd forgotten she'd dumped the broken glass in a skip down the road.
And did the skip reveal these mysteriously disappearing bottles?
It was impossible to tell because it was so full of rubbish. I mean, there certainly was broken glass there, enormous amounts of it, because someone was demolishing a house nearby.
Yes. And so I'm correct in saying, am I not, Detective Constable Banks, there was nothing in Miss Blackley's evidence to the police. It was not either impossible to substantiate or evasive or downright untruthful.
She was certainly very obstructive and evasive.
Thank you, Detective Constable Banks.
Detective Constable Banks. Miss Banks, is it? How long have you been in the police force?
2 years.
You left straight from the university, I believe.
That's right.
Imagine that would make you in your early 20s. You certainly don't look any older, am I right?
I'm 23.
You take your work very seriously, I expect.
Of course I do.
Perhaps a little overzealously sometimes.
What are you trying to suggest?
What I am suggesting is this, that it's hardly surprising that Miss Blackley reacted the way she did in the face of officious behaviour from a girl roughly her own age.
It was a perfectly normal inquiry. There was nothing about my behaviour that was officious.
Oh, come on, Miss Banks. At the time, Miss Blackley was in a most anxious and unhappy state. She readily admits she'd been drowning her sorrows with some gusto, and the effects of the wine had rendered her more miserable, more confused, more vulnerable. Suddenly, she couldn't think why, a young policeman, scarcely out of her teens, not even in uniform, barges into her house and for some inexplicable reason starts bombarding her with questions, ordering her about. Isn't that what happened?
I wasn't ordering her about. If it seemed that way to her, it could only have been because she was so drunk and confused.
After you took Miss Blackley to the police station, how long did you give her to sober up?
After an hour, she was judged to be fit for questioning.
A judgment that was proved wrong, don't you think?
No. We asked her if she felt able to answer questions, and she consented. We certainly didn't want to question her while she was feeling unwell.
No. Miss Banks, the fact that Miss Blackley gave you so many conflicting statements was, I suggest, due to the fact that she was still bewildered and confused and was in no fit state to be questioned.
I don't think so.
You told us, did you not, that Miss Blackley's fingerprints were found around the side door?
Right.
Were they found anywhere else?
How do you mean?
Well, for instance, around the frame of the window through which Miss Blackley has so bizarrely alleged to have entered the house.
Well, no. But it is quite easy not to leave fingerprints.
By wearing gloves, for instance?
Yes.
Yes. I see. So Miss Blackley is meant to have walked up to the house in broad daylight, is she? Carrying a paraffin can, wearing gloves, which, in order to make life easier for the police, she removes in order to place liberal supplies of fingerprints around the door.
I really couldn't say.
Thank you, Miss Banks.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
What is your full name and where do you live?
Eileen Willoughby. I live at the Old Barns, Hexham, Fulchester.
Now, Mrs. Willoughby, where were you on the afternoon of April 23rd this year at about 4 o'clock?
I was on my way back from shopping in the village, coming via Mill Lane.
Now, that's the lane where the Hansen's house and your house are situated.
Yes.
Yes. Did you see a car in the vicinity of the lane?
Yes, at the top of the farm track, just beyond where the Hansens live.
Yes. May the witness be shown the photograph, please, Exhibit 3. Now, was that the car you saw parked there?
Yes, that's it. I gave the number to the police.
Yes. Now, when you saw the car, was there anyone standing by it, as if repairing it, for example?
No, not a soul.
And did the car look as if it had broken down? Was the bonnet up, for example?
No, it was just parked.
Yes, and you're quite sure about the time you saw it?
Yes, 4 o'clock.
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Willoughby.
Mrs. Willoughby, when did you report the presence of Miss Blackley's car to the police?
When they came round and questioned me after the fire, they asked me if I'd seen any suspicious vehicles in the locality.
If you thought the car was a suspicious vehicle, why didn't you report it as soon as you saw it?
Well, I didn't think it was suspicious then.
Well, in that case, isn't it a little, remarkable that you were able to furnish the police with the description of it, its number, and the exact time that you saw it?
What do you mean?
You've told us, haven't you, that you were returning from the shops?
Yes.
You'd be fairly heavily laden with shopping, then?
I was carrying a few things.
How, in a basket?
In my arms.
Oh, in your arms. And you saw a parked car and were not suspicious of it?
Not then, no.
No. Your arms were full of shopping. You saw a vehicle which hardly excited your notice. Aren't we going to find it a little difficult to believe that you then went through all the necessary contortions in order to get a glimpse of your watch, in order to ascertain the exact time that you saw the car?
Well, I knew it was 4 o'clock because I'd left the shops round about 3:30, and it takes me that long to walk back.
Around about 3:30, so you really have no idea what time you left the shops either?
Well, it was around then, around 3 o'clock.
Come on, do you or do you not know the exact time?
Oh, have it your own way.
So you're really not clear about the time you saw the car after all?
Well, I know I'm not certain, but that's not the same thing as... I know, more or less, what time I left the shops. And I know how long it takes me to walk back, because I've done that walk twice a week for the past 7 years. I'm not a fool.
Could you see the Hansen's house from the road as you walked past?
Bits of it, but it's mostly hidden by trees.
Could you see the extension?
Bits of it. But again, it's mostly hidden by trees.
But you could see some of it. Could you tell if anyone was in the region of the extension?
No, because the ground floor part is hidden.
How far is it from the road?
Oh, I've no idea. 40 or 50 yards, I suppose.
Yes, quite near, anyway. And you say there was no one with the car when you walked past. Let's suppose that was because Miss Blackley had already repaired the car and had gone to the front door of the house to speak to Mrs. Hansen. Don't you think if Miss Blackley had been committing the crime she's accused of, you would either have heard her activities or even seen some smoke rising from the extension?
Well, I really don't know. I mean, I wasn't suspicious of the car, so I wasn't looking for anything, was I?
Yes, Mrs. Willoughby, you were not suspicious of the car at the time. So isn't it odd that you were later able to furnish the police with the exact registration number and the make?
I had seen it before, hadn't I?
Oh, yes, you had, hadn't you? And you knew who it belonged to, too.
Well, yes, but I don't see what that's got to do with it.
You're very close friends with Mrs. Hansen, aren't you?
I know her quite well.
Well enough for Mrs. Hansen to confide to you about her marital problem.
Well, she's talked to me once or twice, and I feel very sorry for her.
So sorry for her, in fact, that you were prepared at least once to take up the cudgels in her defence, weren't you?
What do you mean?
Well, there was an occasion, was there not, when you confronted Miss Blackley and Mr. Hansen when they were parked in that very spot and threatened to tell Mrs. Hansen that you'd seen them if you saw them there again?
Well, I don't think you'd be very pleased if your road was turning into one of those lovers' lanes. And it was Mr. Hansen as well. I mean, would you like that going on in front of your front door?
The point is that you didn't like it, Mrs. Willoughby, and I suggest that your attitude makes you a very prejudiced witness.
It most certainly does not.
Can you seriously deny that your antipathy to Miss Blackley is not...
I think she's a stupid little bitch. But I hope that doesn't prevent me from speaking the truth.
I'm sure we all hope that. Consider. You saw Miss Blackley's car in the lane and you thought nothing of it until Mrs. Hansen ran round to your house to telephone the fire brigade. Now, I suggest to you that until then you had no idea of the time you saw Miss Blackley's car, that it was a notion that was put into your head by your conversation with Mrs. Hansen.
You can insult me all you like, but that car was in that lane at 4 o'clock that afternoon.
We only have your word for that, Mrs. Willoughby, the word of someone with such contempt and hostility for Miss Blackley that she's just described her as a stupid little bitch.
Very well, but I have been speaking the truth. You twist anything round and make out it never happened. I just wish you could see what she's done to Lynn, all along, just by being around.
The case of the Queen against Blackley will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court. Today's case in the Crown Court arises out of a fire at the home of Richard and Lynn Hansen. As a result of police inquiries, Tessa Blackley, with whom Richard Hansen was having an affair, is charged with destroying property with intent. Yesterday, evidence was given that a paraffin can was found in Tessa's car, that her car had been seen in the area shortly before the fire, and that Tessa had repeatedly lied to the police when interviewed by them.
Miss Blackley, first of all, will you tell us what happened when you ran Mr. Hansen home the night before the fire?
Well, he'd been very unhappy and withdrawn all evening, and it ended up with him telling me that we had to finish. I mean, this was when we were parked in the lane near his house. He said that was it, and I started crying and begging him not to leave me and saying that I couldn't live without him and stuff like that.
Do you recall saying anything that he might have taken as a threat?
Oh, God, I mean, I really did say that I felt like getting a gun and shooting all three of us, stuff like that. Really sordid and pathetic stuff, but I was so miserable. And, well, you do say things like that, and they never get carried out in the cold light of day. I mean, you wake up in the morning and you cringe at all the things you've said. And I didn't know, did I, that people were going to try and make so much out of it. Make out that it was so sordid.
You were just indulging in a bout of melodrama.
Yes, absolutely.
And what happened after Mr. Hansen's attempt to break off your relationship?
Oh, well, he got out of the car, slammed the door and went off. I sat there for a while. It was raining outside. It was really pouring down. I just sat there, the way you do, feeling how miserable everything is. And then, after a while, I felt that it was time I went home, so I put the key in the starter and nothing happened. I mean, the engine wouldn't start, so I knew what was wrong. The points were wet, but there was no sense in trying to dry them because it was still raining so hard. So I got out of the car and walked back down the lane towards town. After about 1.5 miles, I hitched a lift home.
When did you next hear from Mr. Hansen?
He rang me the next morning. He said that he'd been worried about me and was I okay?
Did you tell him about the car?
Well, I started rabbiting on about it, yes, but then he said that he had to go because he was phoning from home and his wife was hovering. So I started up again and, you know, begging him not to leave me, and in the end he just said, I can't. Leave me, I mean. And it ended up we were going out for lunch the next day.
Yes, were you sure in your mind that the relationship was still on?
Well, it was a stay of execution, wasn't it? I mean, it was still pretty awful, but it was hopeful as well.
Let's move on a bit. When did you leave your office to collect your car?
2:15-ish. I told Clifford, Mr. Ruskin, where I was going. He knew all about the trials and tribulations of my love life. And I got back to Hexham by bus about 2:30, I suppose, but I didn't have much of an eye on the time.
How long do you think you spent preparing your car?
I'm not sure. Half an hour, 3/4 of an hour. I had to take off the distributor cap and dry all the points.
What did you do after that?
Oh, God, well, sorry, I felt so terrible. I just got it into my head that I had to go and talk to Lynn. I know it probably sounds amazingly stupid, but anyway, that's what I felt I had to do. So I went up to the house. I lurked about for a bit, picking up courage, and then I rang and there was no answer. Oh, yes, I looked in through the letterbox. And then I sat down on the step for a bit, and I mean, you don't know what it was like at that time, going around feeling like the end of the world had come. All of us, I suppose. Well, none of us was able to behave very well.
Have you any idea what time you returned to your car?
Well, not really, no. I thought it was around 3:30, but as I say, I didn't have much of an eye on the time. Maybe earlier, maybe later. I filled up with petrol on the way back, and I got into the office about 3:45. I'm pretty sure of that.
As far as you know, did anyone see your return?
Well, no one would really notice. You see, I work in the features department, and that's actually a separate office, so you don't get to see other people from other departments.
There's been nothing unusual about the fact that you can't produce anybody who saw your return?
No. It's just unfortunate that Mr. Ruskin had gone to...
But it was taking an extended lunch?
Well, yes. We'd got all our copy away for the next day. Features works in advance, and he'd gone off to his club.
Did you meet up with Mr. Ruskin later?
Yes, I called in at the club later and had a drink there. And then I started to get a bit maudlin again, and he felt sorry for me and very kindly offered to take me home and said I wouldn't sit there brooding on my own.
You had some more to drink when you got home?
Yes. Well, I hadn't had any lunch, so that made it worse. I got through a bottle of wine, most of the bottle of vodka, I suppose. I was pretty well legless.
When did you cut your hands?
After I'd said goodbye to Mr. Ruskin. There were about a dozen milk bottles outside my front door. I'd had a sort of purge on them in the morning, and, well, to be quite honest, I'm not really very clear about what happened because I was so drunk, but it must have been after I'd said goodbye to Mr. Ruskin. I tripped or fell over or something and cannoned into them. Look, I know it sounds really terrible behaviour, but I was feeling so awful that drinking was the only thing that seemed to help. Anyway, I do remember that I lurched around with a dustpan and brush, and I picked up bits of my fingers and brushed off the step with my hands. I mustn't have been able to feel anything. I must have thought I was bionic woman or something, impregnable to broken glass.
Do you remember where you put the glass?
Well, I must say I thought that I put it all in the dustbin. But the policewoman said that she couldn't find any there. It was pretty full, so I assume I must have gone off down the road and put it all in the builder's tip and then forgotten about it. I can't remember. But then you don't remember everything, do you, when you're that drunk?
Do you remember bandaging your hands?
Well, yes, I do remember, quite a while afterwards, noticing that my hands were quite gory, and I suppose that must have sobered me up enough to bandage them. After that, I got wired into some more vodka, and that was it until the police came.
Why did you tell the police you hadn't been anywhere near Hexham?
Well, oh God, look, I was very drunk. Suddenly, here was this policewoman arriving on my doorstep, barging into my sitting room. I didn't even know that she was a policewoman. She had ordinary clothes on, no uniform or anything. And suddenly I was being asked all these questions. And, well, I don't know why. I got into my head that Lynn had sent her, that she was some sort of a private detective or something. And if I'd been sober, I would have answered all her questions. I would have treated her politely. I wouldn't have behaved like an idiot. There was absolutely no reason for me to pretend that I hadn't been near Hexham. I had been, perfectly innocently. But, well, look, remember that for months I'd been having to conceal my relationship with Richard. And here was this woman, I mean, I was very drunk, terribly confused. Here was this woman who I didn't know who she was, what she wanted, and so I sort of reverted to habit. The habit of having to pretend that my relationship with Richard didn't exist. You know, Hexham, why should I go to Hexham? Who do I know lives in Hexham?
And after that, of course, the police searched your car. They found a paraffin can. Why was that there?
Well, the same reason a lot of other peculiar things are in my car. I happen to be very untidy. What the police didn't say was that they also found all sorts of other things in there. Jerseys, coat hangers, books, carrier bags. I mean, there were magazines in there dated way back in 1977. That's how long it is since I cleaned out my car. And the paraffin can was there because I happened to have a paraffin stove in my flat. It was more or less empty, and I've never got round to filling it up again.
Constable Banks told us that when she took you down to the station, they gave you an hour to sober up. Was that long enough?
No, it wasn't. I felt terrible. It was all a nightmare. I was trying to pull myself together and answer their questions. Well, I mean, I should have asked for more time, but when you're drunk, it's a matter of pride. You do all you can to appear sober. So I felt terrible and confused and sick, and I let them go ahead and ask all those questions.
So what may have appeared to be guilty evasions was simply because you were in a confused state?
Yes. I mean, when I'd sobered up and come down to earth, I told them exactly where I'd been and what I'd done, as I told you.
Now, the party, March the 29th. Was it you or Mrs. Hansen who started the quarrel?
Well, put it this way. I was standing talking to some people, and she was with another group who'd just moved over near me, and suddenly this voice floated over, very loudly. "Oh, there's that little tart of my husband's."
Was it said in such a way that you felt that you were intended to hear it?
Oh, yes. And of course I gave her exactly what she wanted. I told her what I thought of her.
Was Mrs. Hansen drunk?
Yes, I think she was. Well, otherwise she'd never have dreamed of causing a scene at somebody's party. But it's like I said, none of us three was able to behave very well at that time.
Did Mrs. Hansen say anything else?
Yes. She started taunting me. She said, do you really think he'd leave me for a little tart? And he's only after what he can get from you. He's only after a screw on the side and stuff like that. And of course I answered back the only way that I could. I told her that he didn't really give a damn about her, and he was only staying around because of the house. You know, because he didn't want to lose it. And it was just lucky for her that she happened to be part of the furnishings and fittings.
And when you said, tell you what, I think I'll burn the house down, did you expect to be taken seriously?
No, of course I didn't. And what's more, I'd have been credited with a little more sense than saying something like that in public and then actually going off and doing it.
Exactly, Miss Blackley. You were aware that the house mattered a lot to Mr. Hansen.
Oh, yes.
And what did you think was the reason why he didn't leave his wife the house?
No. No, I knew that he still loved Lynn.
Was it ever at any stage in your mind that if the house didn't exist, there would be no obstacle in the way of your relationship with Mr. Hansen?
No, I never thought that at all. Although I did think that part of Lynn's attraction was that she was the established wife in the beautiful home. Well, I didn't have very much to offer as an alternative.
It wasn't the house alone that stood in your way?
No. No, I knew it wasn't. And anyway, even if it had been the house, I couldn't in a million years have done anything to destroy or vandalize it. It was Richard's. It was his work of art. I mean, it would have been like ripping up a painting.
Thank you very much indeed, Miss Blackley.
Now, Miss Blackley, this rather involved tale of yours about your car. I take it you remember the RAC or the AA or some such like?
Yes, I am.
And you are saying that on a rainy and miserable night you chose, instead of calling them out, to take a wet, uncomfortable walk and then hitch a lift home.
Well, I would have had that wet walk anyway, wouldn't I, to find a phone?
Yes, but are you really saying, Miss Blackley, that you chose that alternative in a very arduous bus journey back there the following day?
That's what I did.
Well, Miss Blackley, unless you've got a very good reason for this eccentric course of behaviour, I can only suggest that anyone's going to find it very difficult not to believe it's a figment of your imagination. I ask you again, why did you go to all this unnecessary trouble?
All right, if you must know, Richard and I had been drinking that night, and I did not want to be seen in charge of a car.
Ah, you had been drinking. Really, Miss Blackley, you do fall back on that excuse rather a lot. And of course, conveniently, there was no one there to corroborate your story again. Now, Miss Blackley, you've already proved that you're a ready liar here in court.
I'm sorry, I don't think I've proved that at all.
Your statements to the police were false from beginning to end.
I've explained why.
Ah, yes, that old demon of yours, drink. But come now, Miss Blackley, your lies have been quite apparent.
They are not lies. I don't tell lies. I may do a lot of things that people don't approve of, but I don't tell lies.
But your relationship with Mr. Hansen was based on lies and concealment, was it not?
Well, not my lies. They were his lies.
Well, Mr. Hansen's quite natural wish to keep his marriage going
It's
with
that
no doubt.
natural a wish. Why the hell did he keep seeing me?
Why, Miss Blackley? Because I put it to you that you wouldn't let him go. That you're a calculating and ruthless young woman who is so determined to break up this marriage.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
What, Miss Blackley? Are you saying that you don't want this marriage to break up?
Oh, look, Yes, I do want the marriage to break up. Of course I do. I'd be a hypocrite if I said that I didn't. But you seem to be making out that I would do anything. I'd go to any lengths. Well, I wouldn't.
No, Miss Blackley. Now, you are pregnant for the second time, I believe.
Yes.
And the father, you tell us, is Richard Hansen.
Richard is the father, yes.
Yes. And you had the first pregnancy terminated.
Look, what is this? What has my pregnancy got to do with this?
Well, perhaps it's got a lot to do with it, Miss Blackley. Why did you have an abortion the first time?
Because I felt that I could not bring a child into the world with the situation as it was then.
Very noble, Miss Blackley. And what's so very different about the situation now?
What do you mean?
Well, nothing's changed since your first pregnancy, has it? In fact, if anything, I would say matters were worse.
Nothing has changed, no.
No. In fact, Miss Blackley, I suggest to you that you would go to any lengths to break up this marriage. In the face of impossible difficulties, you are determined to have this baby to increase your hold on Richard Hansen.
Oh, thank you very much. Look, might I remind you that I'm not on trial for being pregnant?
No, but you are on trial for destruction of property with intent to endanger life, Miss Blackley. And I put it to you that just as you're prepared to have this unwanted pregnancy, you are also prepared to set fire to Richard Hansen's house and endanger the life of his wife, to do anything, in fact, to get what you want.
No!
Even when it becomes quite apparent that Richard Hansen no longer wants you.
He does. God, Richard, tell them. He... oh...
So when you saw Miss Blackley on the afternoon of the fire, it was about 5:30?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Were her hands bandaged or cut at that time?
Certainly not.
What about her clothes? Were they grimy or torn?
No, quite clean.
You would have noticed, too, if her manner had been strange in any way, if her manner had suggested that she had been involved in the crime of which she's accused.
My dear lady, Miss Blackley's manner's always a little strange. Her battiness can be quite tiresome at times. No, when I saw her at 5:30 that afternoon, she was her normal self, though she was extremely unhappy about the undeserving young man that she'd been foolish enough to get entangled with. Well, she certainly didn't look as though she'd been vandalizing a house. Knowing Miss Blackley, she'd have probably told us about it if she had done so.
Mr. Ruskin, did she confide at all
I may also add that though Miss Blackley can be a nuisance at times, I like her very much. She's got many excellent qualities. She's got some bad ones too, but having known her for 7 years, I'm prepared to state quite categorically that a compulsion to burn down other people's houses is not one of her faults.
Indeed, Mr. Ruskin. Thank you very much indeed.
Mr. Ruskin, what time did you go to your club?
I imagine it was around 2 o'clock.
Yes, and when did you leave?
No idea. 6.
During that time, were you drinking?
There's very little else to do there.
So, by the time you saw Miss Blackley, you had been drinking for about 3.5 hours.
More than that, I've been drinking during lunch as well.
Really? Well, in that case, I suggest to you, Mr. Ruskin, that by the time you saw Miss Blackley, you were in no fit state to tell what sort of mood she was in. Indeed, you were hardly able to tell whether her hands had been bandaged or her clothes were grimy.
I'm afraid you're rather jumping to conclusions. I didn't say what I'd been drinking or how much. As a matter of fact, before Miss Blackley arrived, I'd consumed vast quantities of rather unpleasant fizzy drink, sole virtue of which it was non-alcoholic. I won't go as far as to say I was stone-cold sober, but neither was I, as you have attempted to imply, in the throes of advanced drunkenness.
For a while, you may well have been impressed by Miss Blackley's apparent frankness and confident manner in the witness box. And there is no doubt she's a very clever, indeed charming young lady. But you must also remember, she's a young lady of violent moods and tempers, who has, in front of witnesses, threatened to kill Mrs. Hansen and to set fire to the house she lives in. She has physically attacked Mrs. Hansen with a quite unwarranted savagery. And she has determinedly pursued her affair with Richard Hansen, fully aware of the heartache it has caused his wife. Now, she certainly had the motive to commit this crime. She has publicly stated her belief that it was this house that was standing between her and her happiness. It was the house, if you like, that was her enemy. Now, she may deny it now, but remember, just before the house burnt down, what she said at that party. You don't think he stays because of you, do you? He only stays because of that bloody house of his. Tell you what, I think I'll burn the house down, then you'll have nothing. Now, Miss Blackley also had the means. A paraffin can was found in her car, and she could only produce a vague and uncorroborated reason for its being there. Her fingerprints were found at the house, although she had denied she was ever there. Her car was seen nearby at the time of the fire. And Miss Blackley has, of course, offered an innocent explanation for this. But remember this, she can produce no one to corroborate any part of her story.
The whole case against Miss Blackley is based on circumstantial evidence. She's given valid reasons for why she lied to the police at first, and valid explanations for the evidence alleged to have linked her to the crime. And most important of all, bear in mind that this case revolves around Miss Blackley's alleged motive, that the house was an obstacle to her relationship with Mr. Hansen. And I suggest you'll be unable to give that very much credence. We know that Miss Blackley was well aware that it wasn't the house that was the obstacle to her relationship with Mr. Hansen. She had no motive for destroying the house. And what's more, we've heard Miss Blackley say that even if it had been the house which was the obstacle, she could never have countenanced such an act of vandalism. Do you remember what she said? It would have been like ripping up a painting. And you may find it highly significant, too, that the most important witness for the prosecution, the person on whose evidence this whole case stands or falls, is the person who would have most to gain from Miss Blackley's disgrace and downfall, Mrs. Hansen.
The charge, members of the jury, is that Miss Blackley, without lawful excuse, damaged by fire the house, intending to damage the property, or being reckless as to whether or not the property would be damaged, and intending to endanger the life of Lynn Hansen, or being reckless as to whether or not her life would be so endangered. And so, members of the jury, your first question must be, did the accused set light to the house? If your answer to this question is no, you will find the defendant not guilty. But if on the balance of probability you say that she did set light to the house, then you must go on and ask yourselves the question, did she do so intentionally? And if she did she intend to endanger Mrs. Hansen's life? Or did she foresee that Mrs. Hansen's life might be so endangered, but not care whether it was? Remember that if there is reasonable doubt, the accused must be acquitted.
Will your foreman please stand? Just answer this question, yes or no. Have you reached a verdict upon which you are all agreed?
Yes.
Do you find the accused guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Tessa Blackley, you are free to leave this court.
A chance for you to join another jury in assessing the facts when our cameras return to watch another case in the Crown Court.